All right, everybody, let's get going. My name is David Parsons. You are listening to Nostalgia Trap, and thank you so much for doing so. As many of you know, I am pitched up in Ventura, California. Actually, it's my hometown. I grew up here. And, you know, it's hard not to comment on the fact right now that the whole fucking state is on fire. I think many other states are on fire right now. And it's just, I mean, I honestly don't even know what to say about it anymore. But I'll try. I grew up here, so I grew up with fires. Fires have been, wildfires have been a part of being a Californian, my entire life. I grew up with memories of in elementary school of holding my hand out and ashes from fires in the mountain, collecting in my hand like snow. And of course, the Santa Ana winds are just a fact of life in Southern California. And when the winds come, something really sort of evil happens to people. There's a great Joan Didion essay about the winds that captures how sort of metaphysically terrifying it is when these hot winds come. And it's not just because of the fires. But I have watched over the years, and I lived in New York for years, and now I'm back living in Ventura. I have watched this get worse and worse. And over the course of the last, I would say, 3 or 4 years, the fire season has basically lasted all year. And it's like, where are we headed with this? To me, it's like looking at city after city in the U.S. right now. People are posting images online of their orange skies and making jokes about, ha, we lived through the apocalypse, ha, ha, ha. And I just made a tweet about that because I'm like, what is our response to this? Because to me, it's like we are heading towards a moment, and I don't know when this will happen, in which these areas of the country are no longer inhabitable. That happened in the 20th century. A little thing called the Dust Bowl, which was a result of human mismanagement of the environment, kicked out millions of people who fled that region and came to California and came to other places in the West. So that history is recent, and I'm thinking about a reverse Dust Bowl situation in which there's a diaspora of 40 million fucking Californians leaving the state. Where are they going to go? I don't think anyone has answers for this shit. And especially not the political class. And I'm sorry, AOC and the Green New Deal, they're not going to do shit about this, okay? This is a psycho-spiritual event in human history that we're not going to have, policies that change the tax structure effectively deal with it, okay? To me, I'm only interested in the people that are suggesting radical solutions to what we're going to be dealing with in our lives. To me, looking out at the orange sky from my window right now, I don't give a fuck about a Green New Deal. I don't give a fuck about a sunrise movement saying, let's use gas instead of coal. All that shit is a joke. To me, we need to have a total revolution in the way we do business here. And we may have to abandon the regions of the world that we've despoiled. And I don't know what that's going to look like. But California, to me, I came here because I wanted to live near my parents. I wanted to return to my hometown. And what I returned to is a place that seems like it's increasingly uninhabitable. And I don't know what the answer to that is. But I'm thinking about it a lot right now because I'm teaching a class on the visual culture of the 1960s. And one of the books that I'm presenting for this class is Howard Brick's Age of Contradiction. I don't know if you know that book. It's an intellectual history of the 1960s, and the subtitle is American Thought and Culture in the 1960s. And just one idea of contradiction that Brick mentions in the book, and the contradiction is sort of the theme that unites everything, is this contradiction in the minds and hearts of young people during the Cold War. Specifically, this idea of young people, the boomer generation, who are growing up put on by their teachers, by the society, by the government, with this Cold War notion of how important they were to this American future, to this global American future, how they were going to go to good colleges and get good jobs and be sort of servants of this project, and how this was such a important moment in history that they were going to play an important role in. And that was going to be through their participation in the society. At the same time, those young people were told to hide under the desk of their school because the world was going to blow up in a nuclear war at any moment. And that contradiction of both being sort of invested in the future at the same time being told that there is no future is something that contradiction drove massive alienation and cultural revolution in the 1960s. And I'm thinking about young people in 2020 who are being told, to work hard and get jobs and participate in the economy. At the same time, the world is burning down. They are stuck on these fucking Zoom lecture meetings that I'm a part of because I'm a teacher. And younger people are stuck on that. And a world of pandemic and political corruption, etc. That contradiction of being asked to participate in a society that is experiencing apocalypse. I think we ought to be thinking about that contradiction because it drives revolution. It's an engine of history. And young people today, I think in 2020, looking around at the world that is quite literally falling apart around them, how can we possibly ask them to engage in a society that is really the culprit of that? And I don't have an answer for that contradiction, but I just wanted to sort of mark the match between the age of contradiction that historian like Howard Brick is identifying in the 1960s and something that's happening right now. How do you go about your everyday life when the sky is orange and choked with smoke? You have to wear a mask anyway because there is a global plague, and that's being absolutely mismanaged by power. I don't know. It's something I've been thinking about a lot because I'm someone who's an adjunct who has to think about jobs and money all the fucking time because I never know. And I'm in that hustle. And I'm kind of like, it's really weird to hustle about jobs while the sky is orange outside and the fires are getting closer and closer and closer. Okay, I don't have an answer for that, but my guest today has a lot of ideas about the young people in the 1960s. I am very excited to bring you this conversation with Jon Wiener. He is one of the authors, along with Mike Davis, of this amazing book called Set the Night on Fire, LA in the 60s. Speaking of fire, he has an amazing career. He's someone who has written about a number of really important issues to the American left. We talk about John Lennon in this conversation. He was Jon Wiener is the person that fought the FBI to declassify the records of what the FBI was doing with John Lennon, why they were interested in him, and why they were particularly interested in silencing him and his effect on American young people. That song Imagine, which we talk a little bit about, it's become sort of a corny song for a lot of young Americans just because it's so long ago, and the Beatles have this particular boomer charge to them now. But if you go back and look at that song and the lyrics of that song, and John and I talk about it in this conversation, it's sort of a blueprint of a lot of really important, I would say, left or anarchic values that are worth thinking about, especially as we're in, I think, a similar sort of psycho-spiritual moment, especially with young people being asked to invest in a society that's not investing in them, and in fact looks like it's reaching an end point. And that counts economically, environmentally, etc. Really, really important stuff. And we talked to Jon Wiener about Mike Davis and what it was like to sort of present this history of Los Angeles, which, again, we've done a lot of episodes about LA lately, in part because I think we're starting to recognize what a critical place Los Angeles is for understanding what the American project is in the post-World War II era. So I hope you enjoy this conversation. We got lots more Nostalgia Trap stuff out there. If you want to support our show, it's really the only support we get is from listeners. So we're trying to, this show is about sort of packaging ideas from the Academy, from writers that don't get enough play in the mainstream, and we're trying to package those ideas and send them out to everybody. So if you want to support us, we would love that. You can do that at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. We just put up speaking of Los Angeles, we just put up a new bonus episode with Justin Rogers Cooper, one of our favorites. And I think, honestly, it's one of the best conversations Justin and I have ever produced about a book by Stephen J. Ross called Hitler in Los Angeles. And it's really about, how to fight Nazis and fascism. And it's not about punching them. Although there is some punching Nazis in the book, it's really more about sort of being cunning and finding ways to undermine them. It's a really fun conversation. You can find that at patreon.com/nostalgia trap. Thanks so much for those that are supporting the show, and I hope you enjoy this conversation. Here is me talking with Jon Wiener. Okay, Jon. Well, thanks for joining me. I feel like you're someone whose name has come up a million times in my life as a young historian, and in the last several months, we have talked about your book that you wrote with Mike Davis called "Set the Night on Fire: L.A. in the '60s." I swear it's come up on the last 15 episodes. So thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it.
Well, it is an honor and a pleasure to be with a fellow historian.
Well, thank you. And I think that one of the reasons why I sent you an email is because, and why me and a number of friends that are on this show a lot are so excited about that book, is because it intersects with all the stuff that we've been thinking about, and really at the same time uncovered a whole history and really put together a whole history that I had never really considered about Los Angeles as this sort of central site in the 1960s. There's so much to talk about, but I guess I wanted to ask you, just to start us off, like, why did you choose to write about Los Angeles at this moment in time? What was the kind of the impetus behind this project?
Well, Nostalgia Trap is our starting point. I mean, it's amazing the coincidence here, but the very first page of our introduction, we talk about the nostalgia for Southern California in the 60s. Gidget, the Beach Boys, surfing culture. It was a paradise for teenagers. Every kid in America wanted to come to Southern California in the 60s. That is the nostalgia trap that your whole show is dedicated to. Mm-hmm. And our starting point is the fact that for millions of working class kids, especially those who were not white, LA in the 60s was not a paradise. It was we like to say, the working class heroes of our story were young people who lived in the flatlands. They didn't live at the beach. They didn't live in the canyons. They didn't live in the Hollywood Hills. So this is a story about especially Black and brown young people and the obstacles they faced and the movements they organized to challenge those obstacles. I should say, this is really a Mike Davis project going back 10 or 15 years. He had always planned and thought and even talked about doing a book on LA in the 60s. He wrote one chapter. He wrote one essay, which now is a chapter, the chapter on the Sunset Strip riots of 1965 and 1966. Happening here, what it is ain't exactly clear. That was published in a journal. You're one of the few people on earth who may know the journal that published that. It is a French bilingual labor history journal called Labor/Le Travail. For some reason, Mike Davis, like 12 years ago, published this piece on the Sunset Strip riots in Labor/Le Travail, and always thought, well, there's a lot more to this story. There's the story of the people who, the working class people of the flatlands. But he, Mike is a busy man with a lot of ideas, and he had like 3 other books he was writing. So he asked me if I would help him finish it. At that point, he had an outline, and he had one chapter. And I said, I'd love to work on it. It's a fantastic project. We need this project. Mm-hmm. At the time, we had the idea that we would interview that it was time before everybody died to interview the activists, but we were a little too late. I mean, basically, interviews are not an important part of our book, and we relied mostly on printed sources. But that was our starting point.
I feel like, I mean, there are a couple things that stand out about the book. One of them is the recovery of this sort of this idea that there were young people, younger than college age, in Los Angeles. I have a friend that's been on this show. You may have heard of him. His name is David Zeiger. He made a
Oh, sure.
documentary called Sir No Sir, and I know that
Sure.
he talks a lot, and he has a lot of archival stuff, and thinks a lot about high school activists in the anti-war movement during the Vietnam era, particularly in Los Angeles. That part of the story is so surprising. I mean, I feel like in part, and I don't know if this is true. How much of this book is aimed at young people? Because it feels like this is a very teachable book. And by that, I mean, it's a huge book. It's like 800 pages, but it feels like each chapter is its own little sort of capsule. And the other thing that I would say, and I don't know if you confirm this or not, Mike Davis's books are not easy. Like his other books, like City of Quartz, like I love them, but they're really complex and they're written in a language that takes a while. Like my undergrads sometimes struggle with those words, but Set the Night on Fire is written in a very straightforward style, and it feels like almost like a manual for a movement. And I'm wondering how much of that was sort of in your imagination while you were making
Well,
this.
thank you very much. First of all, one correction. Of the you say it's an 800-page book, but really there's only 640 pages of. The rest is back matter. So let's not discourage people from picking this up. 640 pages of text, a modest, and
I wished it was 800, John. That's what it was. Yeah.
Thank you. We feel it's way too short, but what makes this different from other Mike Davis books is that it's a pretty straightforward narrative. I mean, there are many topical chapters along the way, but the backbone of the book is a straightforward chronological narrative of Black and brown organizing and movement struggle starting in 1960, and there's three different phases. There's the from like 1960 to about 1965. It's the story of nonviolent direct action. LA. There's a Negro movement in LA, it was called then, that's very much influenced by what's going on in the South, by the sit-ins and the freedom rides, and then the massive street protest in 1963. LA is inspired by and part of a civil rights movement inspired by Martin Luther King. And that's kind of the core of the book. The next chapter then comes Watts. We'll obviously have a chance to talk about this more. After that is the Black Radicalism chapters, the Black Panthers, Ron Karenga, Angela Davis. And then there's all the other movements kind of swirling around this, the anti-war movement, the women's movement, later in the decade, the gay movement, the Asian American movement, the rise of the counterculture, not just beach music, but KPFK radio, the LA Free Press, the Free Clinic, all of these institutions that were extremely important in building a movement. So because it is a narrative and because there are many standalone topics, I think you have pointed at what makes this a more accessible book.
Yeah, and it gives, like you said, a totally different picture of Los Angeles than I think most popular ideas in the popular imagination. And that's something that Mike Davis has written about in his other books, about sort of the clash between the image of Los Angeles and the reality of Los Angeles. And I'm wondering how much of this is an LA story, because it's when I look at when I was young, in 1992.
You're still young, David.
When I was really young. Still young. When I was really young, and I mean that I was in junior high when the LA riots in 92 happened, and I really had no no really historical context for what was going on. And I live in and was born and raised and still live in Ventura, California. So I'm out in those sort of hinterland suburbs of Los Angeles, even further up the coast. And so the discourse up here was a white suburban discourse about the riots. And so I'm wondering, because reading your book with Mike Davis, and we recently, my friend Justin Rogers Cooper, who is a frequent guest on this show, he's a professor at LaGuardia Community College in Long Island City, Queens. We looked at this book too, Stephen J. Ross's Hitler in Los Angeles, and we've been thinking about sort of LA as this site, this very particular site of like an epic confrontation between fascism and forces, structures of white supremacy as embedded in the LAPD and real estate companies. And so like the history of LA is something, since I lived in New York for 15 years and really began my career teaching there, I ended up teaching the history of New York a lot. But coming back and I moved back here in 2017, I've been teaching LA history, and it's really put a lot of these things together for me. But I'm wondering if you could comment on that in terms of Los Angeles as, experiencing this very particular uprising in the 60s, and an uprising of black and brown residents of the city. How much of that has to do with Los Angeles as a very particularly kind of racial set of structures as a city? Because its history is different than other histories.
Yeah, LA, it's a huge place. Millions of people live in the city, and millions more in the county of LA. In the 60s is the great boom period of suburban growth based on the aerospace industry. One of the things that makes LA different from San Francisco and more like Chicago, Detroit to New York is there's a big black migration here for the aerospace industry in the 40s, in World War II. And the way the railroad lines run in America, the railroad lines that come to Los Angeles start in Louisiana, in Texas, in Arkansas. So the blacks who migrated to Los Angeles for jobs in the 40s are a specific kind of subculture of that part of America. Whereas if you were from Mississippi, you went up to Illinois Central to Chicago. And if you were in Georgia or South Carolina, you went up the East Coast to, Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York. So there's a distinctive black community here. Going back to teach the history of LA, so you know about this, and that gives it a special. And there's a lot of black people here. And then, of course, there is Latino LA, Mexican American LA, Chicano LA. Going back, before the white man, I believe it's safe to say. Right. But there's also a very big migration in the 30s, in the 40s. So there's also a very old and stable and rapidly growing, as it was called, Mexican American community in Los Angeles, and that also gives it a distinctive flavor to it. And that's kind of the precursor to our stories. These fairly well-established ethnic, racial communities that have their own leadership, their own press, their own politics, their own radicalism, their own business, their own neighborhoods, and then the 60s happens.
Yeah, and that comes out in that sense that there's sort of like these communities of specific cultures that have newspapers, that have a sort of apparatus, and an apparatus that's ready to sort of distribute information. I mean, all of this stuff happens. What's fascinating to me is we talk about the left struggling to get their message out today during the age of, digital technology, and none of that existing in the 1960s. And instead, I mean, my story with GI coffee houses was told primarily through underground newspapers. And for those that don't know, I mean, those archives are extensive. It's just not a few papers. You're talking about thousands. I mean, quite an intellectual output of revolutionary and radical thought going on during this time. I wonder, because we're doing Nostalgia Trap, John, where I know you're a little bit older than I am. Where were you during all of this? Were you close to Los Angeles in the 1960s, or is this something that was? Because I know you're involved with SDS, But I'm wondering kind of what your experience was.
I went to high school I grew up and went to high school in St. Paul, Minnesota, Central High. And for some reason, I still don't understand. I got I got recruited along with two other of my classmates to go to Princeton. They were interested in diversifying, I guess you could say. Kids who got good grades at public high schools in the Midwest. And I formed an SDS chapter there in the mid-'60s. Then I went to grad school at Harvard, and there was a very big, powerful SDS chapter there, deeply divided between the progressive labor Maoists and the, New Left, whatever we were. I was the other side. I worked in an underground newspaper, the Old Mole in Cambridge. And I didn't come to LA until 1969. Mm. My then girlfriend, who was finishing a history PhD, got a job teaching at UCLA. And 1 month after, so I was going to be sort of like a UCLA faculty spouse and write for Liberation News Service, kind of the wire service of the underground press. That was my plan. 1 month after we arrived, as she was preparing to teach at UCLA, another new hire at UCLA was outed as a member of the Communist Party, Angela Davis. Nobody had ever heard of Angela Davis before.
Wow.
But, and she had, it was never her plan to become the most famous black radical of the 60s. Her plan was, she'd been a student of Herbert Marcuse. She studied Kant's theory of violence. The UCLA philosophy department was a very prestigious place. She was going to teach philosophy at UCLA, work with the Che Lumumba Club of the Communist Party, and do politics. But suddenly, I had just arrived in town. Angela had just been hired and fired. Of course, the regents can't fire faculty members for their political beliefs. That kind of went out with McCarthyism. But my whole first year here was centered around Angela Davis, the fight to get Angela her job back, and then Angela's engagement with the Panthers, and then the police killing the Panthers. So, and the GI movement, which you have studied, kind of organizing in Camp Pendleton. I remember going down to Oceanside to the first big anti-war rally in the town of Oceanside, where active duty Marines, spoke out against the war. Wow. And there was a march where they chanted about Angela Davis. So it was a heady time to arrive in Los Angeles. Mike, my co-author, had been sent here. He grew up in San Diego, in in what we now call the Inland Empire. He was a SDS, dare I say, big shot, national organizer. And he was sent to LA to organize draft resistance in 1965. So he was when I arrived, he was one of the important SDS people on the scene. One of the first people I interviewed for Liberation News Service was Mike Davis.
Wow. I didn't know you guys went back that far.
50 years.
Wow.
I think it's 50 years.
One of the things we try to get at on this show is sort of where do people's political ideals and values come from? And it seems like you've lived a life. My father was born the same year as you, 1944. And I feel like that's a very common trajectory we've heard of people that are born and sort of come of age during the Cold War. But I wonder what's your take on that? Are you a red diaper baby? Were your parents radicals? Where did you get your political values from?
My parents were good Minnesota liberals. The Democratic Party of Minnesota was and still is called the DFL, the Democratic Farmer Labor Party. It was merged with this populist left-wing party of the 30s. So this was the era of Hubert Humphrey and Eugene McCarthy, and they were, before the war in Vietnam, they were big defenders of civil rights. And I did have I think my grandfather told me about a friend or cousin of his who had been a lawyer for the Wobblies in the Mesabi open pit iron ore strikes of 1917 in northern Minnesota, but that wasn't really part of my heritage. But my idea, I grew up reading about the radicalism of the Bay Area, the anti-HUAC demonstrations of 1960, what was going on the Berkeley campus. And my idea as a high school student, I was a good liberal too. I thought Kennedy was great and he was going to change America, and we hated Nixon, but my idea was you go to college to become part of radical student politics, like they do at Berkeley. And in fact, my high school girlfriend did go to Berkeley and was part of the free speech movement, but I went the other direction, and there really wasn't the radical politics on the East Coast. Let me just say, this was not at Princeton University, but so we were getting started. Norman Thomas had been a Princeton alum, a predecessor of ours, so he was kind of head of the Socialist Party in America in the 40s, 50s, 60s. So there were a few isolated figures, but you joined SDS, so Tom Hayden was organizing in Newark, up the New Jersey Central train, and there was a lot of other things. And in fact, Mike Davis was organizing before the Vietnam War. SDS had a project. This is almost completely forgotten, but I was reminded of it by an undergraduate at Princeton writing her dissertation on this, on when was the first anti-apartheid demonstrations in the United States. Well, around 1964, SDS organized a campaign to get Chase National Bank to divest. And I can remember we went into Manhattan and had a big noisy demonstration on Wall Street outside Chase National Bank. And I later learned that the person who presented our demands at the front desk was Mike Davis, the SDS leader of this thing. I didn't know him at that point, but that was really the first appearance of Mike Davis in my life, which I only came to appreciate a little later. So that was the beginnings for me.
This guy's like Forrest Gump. He's showing up at every campaign. One of the through lines in the book is sort of this idea of counterculture, and you sort of get a different notion of counterculture. And you mentioned, I feel like that was really present in Los Angeles in terms of just the landscape of institutions. Going to radical bookstores, or you mentioned KPFK. There's this kind of like building of counterculture institutions. I wonder if you could comment on that, because it's a world that I don't really. I can read about them, but I don't really. Is there an area in Los Angeles? Was there like a hippie area that would be the equivalent of a Haight-Ashbury? Or is it more spread out than that? Because I'm thinking about this documentary on hip hop that I don't know if you've seen, but it's about the Good Life Cafe, which is about this health food store in Los Angeles, in South Central, where young Black people in the 1990s were going and doing like sort of an alternative radical poetry hip hop show there. And it ended up being this sort of intersection of, health food and, this sort of like hippie vegan movement, but also a little bit of like radical politics and what we might call, anti-police brutality and, intersecting. I'm wondering if you could comment on that, because I feel like a lot of people seem to put those things in tension. Like there's a counterculture and then there's a serious political people. But it seems like your story shows it being a little bit more of a mix.
Absolutely. There's this nexus of KPFK, the first listener-supported non-commercial radio station in Southern California, and really the second in the United States, I think, after KPFA in Berkeley. This was founded by old left pacifists, actually, the Pacifica Foundation. And they were not a left-wing institution at the beginning. I mean, their idea, what FM radio was in the 50s was classical music, and then kind of high-minded public affairs, hour-long lectures by, Harvard professors who were liberals on the alienation of modern man, or the corporate elite, or something like that. But KPFK gave birth to the LA Free Press, which became by far the biggest independent. What do we call them? Then they were the underground press. Then they later became the alternative press. KPFK became a left-wing station only not by choice, but they were committed to the idea of balance in public affairs news reporting. And that meant they invited right-wing commentators like William F. Buckley and left-wing commentators. And then the rational listeners would be able to decide. But the left-wing commentator they invited was the head of the Communist Party of Southern California, Dorothy Healey, who was a very well-known and inspiring figure to young people of my generation. Dorothy had a show called Communist Commentary. Now, in the 50s, this is an incredibly brave and bold and reckless thing to call your show. You should call it like, For a Peaceful World, or, but her politics were to tell people what she thought and not hide behind euphemisms. And immediately two things happened immediately. First of all, they got investigated by HUAC. Their license was threatened by the FCC. And second of all, the right-wing commentators all quit. They wouldn't be on a station that broadcast a show called Communist Commentary. So KPFK was left being a left-wing show, a left-wing station that was most famous for its Communist Commentary by Dorothy Healey. So then they survived the license challenge. They stood up to HUAC, and they reconceived the notion of balance, the notion that KPFK has today, which is we provide balance to the mainstream media. We're the left side, and that's the balance that we are encouraging people to pursue. Anyway, KPFK also originated another great counterculture institution. What was it called? The Renaissance Pleasure Fair started as a KPFK fundraiser. Now it's become a kind of a capitalist enterprise. But at the beginning, it was a KPFK fundraiser. And it had a joke newspaper that was put out by a guy who came out of the old left, out of the SWP. Art Conkin was his name, and he's one of the heroes of our book. He's not a new leftist. He's not a kid. He's already in his 30s. This is in the early to mid 60s. He's worked as a journalist. He's worked on the SWP newspaper. He worked at a community newspaper in East LA. And he had a conception of what an alternative newspaper could be and how it could be financed. He did not run it as a communal enterprise. He raised the money. He was the publisher. He was the editor, and he ended up with 250,000 readers. And incredible. And as you say, I mean, I believe your book, Dangerous Grounds, opens with a quote from the LA Free Press.
Yeah. Yep.
This was not just sex ads and music reviews. This was hard reporting by talented writers. And the proving grounds for the LA Free Press came a year after they were founded in 1965 with the Watts riots. Art Conkin knew Black writers who were active in CORE and got them to write about what was going on in the Watts uprising for the LA Free Press. The LA Times was a very right-wing newspaper run by the Chandler dynasty at that point, very racist. They had no black anything. I think they had one black freelancer as a photographer, and that was it. So this really established the LA Free Press as a crucial institution for understanding all of LA that the Chandlers were not going to tell the truth about. So there you had, and KPFK had a serious news operation, the LA Free Press, and that's kind of the institutional basis of
Mm-hmm.
a lot of what happened.
Yeah, and it makes you, for me at least, think a lot about what that term counterculture really means. Like, what do we mean by that? And you know, saying that, you know, we're the actual, you know, balance to the rest of the culture, which is rather, you know, right wing or liberal. We're offering, you know, that sort of counterculture beyond just the sort of sex, drugs, and rock and roll, which I think is what most people think of when they think of counterculture. And
Yeah.
that's kind of interesting to me that you know, because the music, you know, if you think of like you know, Jimi Hendrix and Janis Joplin and all that sort of stuff, it's not really counterculture anymore. I mean, that stuff became like, you know, mainstream and it's everywhere. And when you think of counterculture as sort of a genuine culture that is counter to the mainstream, it would connect to radical politics in my mind.
Yeah, well, and sometimes it did. Sometimes it did.
Mm.
You know, can I say a few words about the free clinic? Because the free
Please, yeah.
clinic doesn't. It's at the end of our book, and I think a lot of people don't get all the way to the free clinic chapter. But the L.A. Free Clinic was one of the first institutions in America to assert healthcare as a human right. Healthcare should be free for everybody. They had a more radical conception of free, not just free of charge, but also free of hierarchy, free of means testing, free of cultural preconceptions, free of, you know, their big thing was free of moral judgments of people who were drug addicts or who had STDs or, you know, who were homeless. Free of moral judgment was a very important part of the conception of the free clinic. And it's a very visionary, very radical idea. It was staffed completely by volunteers. You asked about the locations of all of this. Well, the free clinic was on Fairfax, south of Sunset. Sunset Strip was partly there were coffee houses that became kind of centers of under 21 youth culture. There were also music clubs, and the Free Press was published out of a basement on Sunset Strip. So that was and the Free Clinic was up there partly because their original idea was that their clientele would be street people, runaway kids who had drug problems, STDs, needed a place to stay, were interested in some kind of work. So it was a huge operation, and staffed completely by volunteers, quite fascinating. And then, of course, the other physical location of everything for white people was Venice, which had been a bohemian community from the 50s, a center of the beat culture, poetry readings, coffee houses, jazz. There's a book about that called Venice West, about the 50s in Venice, and that kind of morphed into radical politics, became a base of the Peace and Freedom Party, launched a campaign to get independence from the city of Los Angeles. And they had their own institutions, they had their own underground newspaper, their own music. The Doors came out of Venice.
Yeah, it's sort of, this picture is of this confluence of things happening. And I mentioned many times on this show, there was a store in my town called Wild Planet that was the one, psychedelic store that sold, Jimi Hendrix posters and things like that. And the iconography was there. But they also, and I've told this story many times, they also had cassette tapes. And this is in the late 80s and 1990s, cassette tapes of like Noam Chomsky lectures and things like that.
Wow.
That sort of drew me in and sort of made me think that there was some other world of politics that was beyond even, Democrats and Republicans, which is all you really get from the mainstream press. And the other thing I wanted to say about that kind of...
Let me ask a question.
Yeah.
Let me ask a question.
Go for it.
Who produced Noam Chomsky cassettes?
They were like...
Do you have any idea where they came from?
They were very homemade looking. They looked like, they were printed very, very... Some of them had handwritten. This is Chomsky at this college speaking. And so, you talk about... I mean, that's another thing about... And I wonder if it's accelerated left politics in our era, is just the availability of that stuff. I mean, I didn't even know it existed, first of all. And then once I knew it existed, I accessed it through the counterculture, which I wonder what you think of that, because Fred Gardner, the guy who began the coffee house movement, his wager was that there were enough young people in America that were sort of counterculture. They were oriented towards this sort of, the rock and roll sort of lifestyle, and that they were totally alienated from anything in the U.S. military. And he thought, well, we can actually draw young people who are in the military, drafted, unhappy, draw them into these coffee houses that have a sort of colorful psychedelic counterculture presentation with Bob Dylan posters and such, and that we can hit them up with underground newspapers and a radical message, and maybe start a GI movement. And that happened. To some extent that did happen. But I'm wondering what are there other? I mean, because I think your book kind of intersects with this. That there are other organizations that sort of had that idea, right? That the counterculture would be some sort of language of revolution, if that makes sense.
Well, tell me more about what you're thinking here.
I'm just thinking that that young people, sort of their entryway into radical politics was the counterculture. Yeah. And I'm wondering if you think that's true at all. I mean, a lot of people they laugh at that idea. They think people's entryway to politics is through, their material circumstances or a college class. But it seems like the counterculture, and it's not like everybody that was into Jimi Hendrix got into left-wing politics, but it seems like there was a connection between those things in the 60s that seemed powerful. Yeah,
I think so. And I mean, it was always it was always complicated by the efforts of the entertainment industry to, as we say, colonize youth culture. So a big record label, movie, making a hit movie about Woodstock, and then that would be put up for an Academy Award. This was a complicated problem of how we're supposed to relate. And of course, if you're in a band, you want a record contract. You want to be a distributor. You want to play at the, good clubs and be sent on a national tour. So there was, we call it a tension.
Yeah. And I mean, you've written, and it's a long story, so we don't need to get all into it, but you've written about John Lennon, and, who's a figure that sort of bridges exactly what we're talking about here, right? Like a figure who was a huge, rich rock star who's also, sort of singing a lot of the values of the counterculture and maybe radical politics. But I wondered, can you clear up John Lennon's politics for us? Because for me, I'm kind of like, I feel like the left thinks about this a lot through the music, because I'm thinking about a song like Revolution, where he's sort of like, they're like, we don't want to be with Chairman Mao, and, we want to just, it'll be all right. It's going to be all right.
Yes.
Whereas a song like Imagine, to me, that's like an almost like manifesto of anarchy. And the first line of Imagine, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't it there? Imagine there's no countries, right?
Imagine no more countries. Imagine no more countries. It isn't hard to do.
Right.
Nothing to kill or die for.
Yeah.
And no religion too.
Right.
That's a good start. Okay, that's a good place to start. I wrote a whole book trying to straighten out Lennon's political trajectory, because like many people who were thinking in the late 60s, he changed his mind a lot. So it's interesting that the Beatles, especially once they got to be famous, remember they had these working class roots in Liverpool that they never really, wanted to forget about. They wanted to engage with the times. They did not like the lives of rock stars living in luxury hotels. They, especially John, and to a lesser extent George Harrison, they wanted to be part of the world of young people. That was who was having fun. It wasn't that much fun being a millionaire Beatle. So, they met radicals. They talked in Britain. Remember, there was this an underground left-wing newspaper called the Red Mole in Britain that was edited by Tariq Ali and Robin Blackburn. They're still around. And they did a long interview with Lennon about his political views. So he started out, you're quite right. The first thing they wrote a song addressed to the revolutionaries, the kids in the streets, saying, when you talk about destruction, don't you know that you can count me out?
Right. Yeah.
And this was kind of, here's what we're shaking our finger at you kids causing trouble out there. I believe we've heard a few of those similar sentiments in the last month or two.
Yes, totally. Yeah.
A year later, this was the single. A year later, on the White Album, they did a slower version of the same song, Revolution. And if you listen closely, Lennon changes the line. He adds the word, when you talk about destruction, don't you know that you can count me out in? Now he's ambivalent. Maybe he wants to be counted in. Maybe he wants to be part of this. Then they write, give peace a chance. All we are saying is give peace a chance. Now this is a criticism of the Maoist and left-wing ideologies that have this complicated radical discourse and analysis. All we are saying is give peace a chance. Mm-hmm. And they wanted that to become the anthem of the anti-war movement, and it did become the anthem of the anti-movement. I mean, I can remember being in Fifth Avenue peace parades, something we had once a year, and there would be thousands of people just doing that line over and over again. All we are saying is give peace a chance. At the November 1969 was the biggest anti-war demonstration in history up to that point. The mobilization, it was in Washington, D.C. and 50 cities across the country. Mm-hmm. And Lennon went to D.C. and sang, all we are saying is give peace a chance. Pete Seeger was there, and he sang, all we are saying is give peace a chance. And Pete Seeger's an old commie, so he knew he wanted to say a lot more than give peace a chance,
Right.
But he could see this was a song for the moment, work to bring together all the diverse parts, especially the newer people in the anti-war movement. Then Lennon moves to New York with Yoko Ono, and this is in 1971, very much wants to become part of the radical movement, meets Jerry Rubin and Abby Hoffman. They kind of recruit him to a project of theirs. It was quite a good idea. Lennon would lead a national concert tour that would coincide with the lead up to the 1972 presidential election, where Nixon was going to be running against George McGovern. McGovern was the peace candidate. Nixon had been prosecuting the war for 5 years. And the idea was they would not just sing Give Peace a Chance, but they would be anti-war speakers like Abby Hoffman and Jerry Rubin, and they would do voter registration on site during the concert. It's a pretty good idea, really. I mean, It's been mobilized since Rock Against, Racism and all of these since the 80s. It's become kind of a standard thing. Bruce Springsteen did a lot of this sort of work.
Well, even Wattstax, the Wattstax concert, which is something that if people who are listening haven't watched that, you can watch the whole thing on YouTube. And it offers a portrait of the sort of intersection of Black radical politics and culture in a way that it makes me think a lot about today, because I'm kind of wondering, okay, who are the figures that are this way? You wrote about, I know, the FBI sort of going after Lennon, and it seems like the state is aware that there is a power in people who can kind of communicate these values in song. Like, it feels like Bob Marley was a similar type of figure, right? It's like these are dangerous figures.
You're pointing directly at the end of this John Lennon stories. Before he can launch this nationwide voter recruitment rock concert tour, it would have been the first tour of the United States by any of the ex-Beatles since the lads waved farewell in Candlestick Park in 1965. So it would have been a huge deal for a Beatle to tour in 1972 in an effort to stop this, in a successful effort to stop this. The Nixon administration notified Lennon that he was going to be deported, that his admission to the United States had been in violation of then existing policy. At the time, the policy was that if you had been convicted of any drug offense, no matter how minor, no matter what the circumstances, you were ineligible for admission to the United States. And Lennon had pled guilty to a misdemeanor charge of cannabis possession in London in 1969. So he had a very poor case for staying in the United States, and his lawyers told him, you have to cancel this tour thing. You have to be a good boy from now on, or you're going to be kicked out of the United States. And that hurt him a lot. You know, he didn't want to. He was always an anti-authoritarian going back to, grade school in Liverpool. So it kind of wrecked his life for the next, 6 or 8 years. The concert tour was never held. Lennon's lawyers managed to hold on. And he, as you know, he was never deported. And in fact, Lennon was, while Lennon stayed in New York, Nixon was kicked out of the White House in Watergate. And so that was a little bit of satisfaction for Lennon. But it is a perfect example of what you're saying. The president of the United States fears the political potential of a rock concert tour of the United States when it is consciously brought together with political organizing of young people. That was the key, that he wasn't just going to sing the song. He was going to organize young people to vote.
Yeah, and that story also is pretty chilling because it intersects with this idea of the state using drug policy to go after radicals. And it seems like that's no coincidence that we get such a huge expansion of the war on drugs coming out of actually the Nixon administration, right? But I mean, you may find this in my book, is that I there's a letter from J. Edgar Hoover where he's explicit about that with the coffee house movement and saying that, look, these people who are circulating in these coffee houses are all smoking marijuana. That's the way to get them. Tell local law enforcement that that's the way to get them. And indeed, many of the leaders of those movements were put in jail for long sentences for often tiny amounts of marijuana. And it just seemed like that was, again, sort of, this intersection of counterculture and radical politics seems like it's more pronounced and more serious than we often think about.
And this was actually one of Lennon's causes. John Sinclair was a music manager in Detroit and a very radical left-wing organizer. And he was caught by an undercover agent with 2 joints and sentenced to 10 years in state prison in Michigan. And Lennon did a concert to get him out of jail. And the song there was they gave him 10 for 2. What else could the bastards do? We got to set him free.
Wow. That's incredible. Yeah, that part of it comes out a lot, and it's something that it's a tension within the movement that never got really reconciled. A lot of the people within the GI Coffee House movement thought that the sort of answer was to run a clean coffee house, but
it is a way to avoid being arrested.
That's true, but they also went after them for other things too. So it just ended up, turning into vigilante violence and all sorts of stuff. But I'm wondering about because I know I don't want to take all your time, but I wanted to ask you this, John, which is because I think you can offer a really valuable perspective. I don't want to put you on the spot, but the sort of idea of like being an academic and being a person that holds these sort of left values. You had like the McCarthy era in which left and radical professors were sort of purged from the university. But at the same time, I feel like the 1960s, there was this sort of push to bring radicalism into the university. And that's where we got like Black Studies departments, and we got a sort of conception that the university could actually be a force of radicalism in the culture. I wonder where that's gone, if that still exists, and how you've kind of navigated that on your own. In other words, what were you thinking in the late 60s as you were becoming an academic historian? Like, how does that connect to the politics? I think that's what I'm asking, because I'm kind of forging the same path, John, where I sort of have these radical values, and at the same time I'm sort of in the university, and I'm trying to figure out a way to, reconcile those things.
Well, as you know, the the economics of public education have been radically transformed over the last couple of decades. In the 60s was the golden age of the expansion of public education in the United States. The University of California opened like 5 new campuses. They were hiring right and left. There was plenty of money because the economy was booming, especially in California. And they wanted to hire, the smart new PhDs to run all of these new public university campuses in California and 49 other states, really. And those kids happened to be the 60s generation. They had, the Vietnam War, the Civil Rights Movement were where they had come of age. So there's just this coincidence of the biggest expansion in history of higher education, with the people getting PhDs are the new left. And they're feminists, as you say. They've been fighting for Black studies when they were in graduate school. Epoch in the United States, the 60s and the beginning of the 70s. Then, of course, in the 70s, there's a big economic downturn. The campuses are all built. California has built one since then, UC Merced, which is kind of half of or a quarter of a university. Gradually, then Prop 13 strips the state of the ability to fund these places, so they all get lots more dependent on private funding, on rich people donating the things that rich people like to donate, which is a building for the management school or something like that, or biomedical research. And then people like you come along, and they're not hiring hundreds and thousands of smart young guys and gals. Opposite. They are trying to get rid of the oldsters like me and hope that they'll all retire. And they're replacing us with people like you who they don't have to pay much, who they can get rid of if there's an economic downturn, like there may very well be this fall. Not enough people enroll. We don't want a big tenured faculty. We can't afford it anyway. The endowments don't cover this. So I was incredibly lucky to come along when I did, and you, I hate to say it, are incredibly unlucky to come along when you did. And it has nothing to do with your, talents or abilities or my talents, abilities, really.
Yeah. Well, we talk about that golden age a lot. All of us young academics were so bitter about it. But yeah,
rightly so.
Yeah. At the same time, it's sort of it's weirdly kind of freeing because I don't feel an intense obligation to any particular institution. And I can make my podcast and sort of be the public intellectual that I want to be without having to answer that at the same time. Yeah, I don't have a full-time job or any of those things that that previous generations got. I'm wondering, in terms of that, that long decline, how do you keep your sort of, I often wonder about the people in the 1960s that sort of had an idealistic vision, tried very hard to stop the Vietnam War, and were in the midst of really, a political fight that was that sort of, was a massive part of each of these people's identities, was sort of, this fight. But then, after that, how did you deal with this emotionally, John, dealing with decades of the right wing sort of winning and, Reagan and George H. I mean, I don't know if you could have imagined all of that in 1969. It feels like, I think about those Hunter S. Thompson saying that, we had this moment where we thought it was all going to come together, and then do you have that narrative of despair at all, or are you a person that was able to sort of track hope in that? Because it feels like there's this story of like the left in the 60s and then no left after that, but I know that's not entirely true. There's always been some resistance to this.
Well, I don't know, just somehow constitutionally, emotionally, I've always been a movement person. And if you're a movement person, the struggle continues. It has ups, it has a lot of downs, but it's steady work. There's always something to do. And my I had a kind of a, for most people in the university becomes the focus of their politics and their lives and their work. So it's around, feminist studies, African American studies, diversifying the curriculum, diversifying the student body, diversifying the faculty, and there's a kind of academic Marxist theory that's pretty opaque and not that useful to the rest of the world. On the part practiced by some people.
Sure.
That's kind of the deformation of being in the university. I always had one foot outside the university. I had a department that liked me, run by people just a little older than me, and I had a lot of energy, and I'd been a left-wing journalist and writer, and was able to keep doing that, and that kind of steady work. Totally interesting, I must say, to keep track of what's going on in the country. And I got, especially if you're a history professor, you get to teach about it and tell young people what you think has happened in the world. So that combination of being able to talk to young people within the bounds of academic propriety, of course.
Sure.
And then have this second sort of somewhere between hobby and career. I became a contributing editor to The Nation magazine, and I've been doing that since the mid '80s. So that's how I have done it, and for a lot of people, it's been a lot harder, either because they didn't have such friendly, immediate supervisors, or because they were in fields that weren't quite so amenable to getting paid to think about how did we get here.
I'm so glad you mentioned teaching, because I feel like, and I know people will push back against this, whatever. I feel like, being in a room and even, though we're Zooming right now, I still have contact with them. But teaching history and sharing those ideas with young people seems like such a rewarding and valuable thing. And I do think of it as political work, even though, within the bounds of the, university propriety, whatever. To me, this information, just the history itself and the stories that you tell in this book, of young people in high schools getting together and doing these extraordinary actions, telling other young people about this, to me is really fun, and often comes with young people today telling me, wow, I had no idea any of this existed. And it's almost like, I'm trying to do for them what was done for me by other, counterculture institutions, that Wild Planet Chomsky tape, whatever it was that kind of pushed me to seeing a different kind of view of American history. I think of that as a really important thing. And I'm wondering, just maybe to wrap up, I mean, we're seeing right now, John, a sort of explosion in the last several months of young people on the streets. And I know it's like, it's a huge subject and you've talked about it before, but I'm wondering, is it surprising to you to see this as someone who's comes from this era and has written about, is there any way to kind of get our sort of mind around why this moment? Why all of a sudden in 50 states do we have young people in the streets in a way that, people on the left have been waiting for decades for this sort of scenario?
Yeah, I find it totally inspiring. I mean, what's been going on for the past few months, this summer, has been so much better than anything we had in the 60s. It's so much bigger. It's in every city and town in America has had Black Lives Matter demonstrations. It's so much more diverse. I mean, Newport Beach had a Black Lives Matter demonstration with hundreds of people. Now, Newport Beach is like the most wealthy, Republican, conservative place in our world. And if Black Lives Matter is establishing a beachhead in Newport Beach, there's something happening here.
Yeah.
It's bigger, it's broader, it's more diverse, it's much smarter, I think. I mean, they have a way of combining protest and politics. We're running a progressive candidate for district attorney, looks like he's going to win. George Gascon, if you're in Los Angeles, vote for George Gascon on November 4th. A progressive district attorney who's going to abolish bail. He's going to abolish prosecutions for, jailing people for misdemeanors. He's going to prosecute bad cops. He's going to fire bad cops. This is in the second biggest city in the United States. This is a huge thing. And it's something Black Lives Matter has been talking about for years, but we have a candidate. He was endorsed by the governor yesterday. Nothing like this ever happened in the 60s. Yeah. And basically, I've thought a lot about why is this happening? I think partly it's because Black Lives Matter is a much smarter and more focused and more stable and more successful organization than we ever were. And when I've asked people about it, I asked Melina Abdullah, how come you guys are so much better at this than we were? She said, part of it is, Black Lives Matter is basically led by women, founded by women 7 years ago and led by women. And so somehow they don't have the kind of, what shall we call it? Macho posturing and internecine battles and faction fights and power trips that were, a big problem for my generation. And then there's also the technology of the cell phone video. Let's not overlook that.
That's really interesting. Yeah, that's because when you do think about the way the 60s falls apart, a lot of it is around ego, and I think about also just the feminism existing in the 60s in part because of women's experience in the movement. Right? It wasn't just like people experiencing sexism in their homes. It was actually on the left. So yeah, that's a really important point. John, thank you so much for talking with me. I really appreciate it. And good luck with everything. And I hope we get to talk again.
This was great. Thanks so much for having me.
Okay, huge thank you to Jon Wiener. I had a really fun time talking with him. I feel like there are so many areas of his life and his career as a historian that are worth investigating. But check out Set the Night on Fire, LA in the 60s. And all his stuff on John Lennon is so incredible too. So thanks, John, for sharing your ideas with us, and thanks for all the people who are listening to the show and supporting the show. As I said, we've got a really intense and I think compelling and useful episode with Justin Rogers Cooper on our Patreon page this week on the book by Stephen J. Ross, Hitler in Los Angeles. Really amazing story, and I'll leave it at that. But go check that out if you want. If you're not a subscriber, you can do that at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. Onward and upward. We'll talk to you again very soon. I hope you're safe and loving life wherever you are. Take care. Bye-bye.